Along with the debate about gay marriage, another set to divide delegates at the ALP National Conference is that on asylum seekers. Joining me this morning to discuss is the Immigration Minister Chris Bowen. Minister, good morning to you.
Good morning to you, Kieran.
I want to ask you about this proposal reported in this morning's Fairfax Press that you're going to take to the ALP conference, a substantial increase, almost doubling the refugee intake to 20,000 refugees in Australia per year. Is that conditional on the establishment of a regional framework to deal with people smuggling?
Well, Kieran, I've had this view for some time. I've expressed it for some time that Australia can and should take more refugees. And, of course, the first stage in that was the increase of 1,000 a year under our Malaysia arrangement. The Labor Party conference is a good opportunity, the appropriate opportunity every 2 years for National Conference to agree on Labor's principles, broad outline of our approach. And I am going to take this opportunity to suggest to the party the aspiration over time of increasing our refugee intake to 20,000 people a year. I'll also be making the point that Labor should stand solidly and clearly for regional arrangements which discourage dangerous boat journeys to Australia, and that for the reasons of fiscal discipline and public confidence, that you can have the conversation with the Australian people about increasing the refugee intake if you have the appropriate steps in place to discourage people taking that dangerous journey by boat.
So is the proposal to almost double the refugee intake conditional on having that offshore policy, that regional framework enshrined on the ALP platform?
Well, I'll be putting to National Conference that Labor should stand for an increase in refugees if we do have regional agreements in place which discourage the dangerous journey by boat to Australia. The reason for that is twofold. One, it would be fiscally irresponsible just to increase the refugee intake at the same time as having all the cost and expense which goes with a high level of boat arrivals. And secondly, I've made the point many times that it's important we have public confidence in our refugee program. If you engender that public confidence through an orderly program, then I think the Australian people are very open to a conversation about increasing the refugee intake. Now, the Liberal Party says that we already take enough refugees, that the 1,000 I proposed as part of the Malaysia arrangement was too many. I fundamentally disagree. I think we can and should take more refugees, but I also stand strongly for an orderly program, including regional arrangements to discourage the dangerous boat journey to Australia.
You've said you expect the support of the conference on this. Does that include the support of the left?
No, look, I think we'll have a robust debate. We always do. Every national conference I've ever been to has had a robust debate about asylum seekers. I expect this one to be no different. I do expect, though, that there'll be many things we agree on. I think there'll be a broad level of agreement that we should acknowledge Labor's strong record here, and there'll be agreement that we should increase our intake over time as our aspiration. But I don't expect that this will be any different when it comes to a strong and solid debate about offshore processing, for example.
Yeah, so the left are not going to back this anyway because they remain opposed in principle, fundamentally opposed to offshore processing.
There are people in the party with a strong view about that. I have an equally strong view, and many would agree with me, that a proper regional regime with offshore processing as a part of that, with a discouragement to boat arrivals, is firmly in line with Labor principles, firmly in line with the Labor tradition of discouraging people making that dangerous boat journey, giving people in refugee camps around the world, whether they be in the Middle East, in Africa and Asia, a fair chance of resettlement into Australia if they can't afford a people smuggler, and stopping people making that boat journey, which we've seen even in recent weeks is highly dangerous and risks lives.
Minister, it's unlikely to improve the prospects of this in Parliament, though, isn't it? With the Greens also, the independent Andrew Wilkie and others very much opposed to the fundamental proposal that you continue to espouse, and that is offshore processing. So the Malaysia deal through Parliament still, even if you do reintroduce it next year, it looks very, very unlikely to get through.
We're quite right, Kieran. Unless the Liberal Party supports offshore processing through our legislation, then it won't pass the Parliament. The numbers have changed in the House of Representatives, that's true. As Mr Morrison has said, I acknowledge that, but they haven't changed in the Senate. The way that this legislation can pass the Senate is by Tony Abbott changing his position and supporting legislation for offshore processing. Without that, the practical and legal reality is onshore processing, and we will continue to see high numbers of boats arriving, and we'll continue to see people risking their lives.
Will you bring it back to the Parliament anyway?
Well, we'll be arguing for our policy both inside and outside the Parliament, Kieran, as you can imagine. We'll be progressing that in the way that you would expect us to.
On a few other issues, you support a conscience vote on gay marriage. If the Prime Minister is rolled, that would be a very bad look, wouldn't it? It would undermine her leadership.
Well, I do strongly support a conscience vote on gay marriage. I think that is the only responsible and sustainable approach. Last night, as you pointed out in your introduction, there was a vote in the Queensland Parliament on civil unions. That was a conscience vote. I think we should have more conscience votes in Australia. I said this when I was a backbencher, that it's good for the body politic to have robust debates on the floor of Parliament with individual MPs making their own mind up and justifying their position to their electorates, and the Australian people being able to see that debate on the floor of Parliament in a very open and transparent way. And I think this is a prime candidate for a conscience vote. I don't think this is the sort of thing that should be rammed through a national conference. I think this is the sort of thing that the Australian people would want to see debated on the floor of the Parliament with every individual MP making up their own mind. I think the Labor Party should adopt a conscience vote on this. I think the Liberal Party should adopt a conscience vote on this. And I think the Parliament should be able to have a proper debate about it.
Will the factional leaders recognise the damage that would be done to the Prime Minister if she was rolled on this and pull back?
Well, look, I expect the National Conference to endorse the Prime Minister's position because it's the right thing to do, because it's the responsible thing to do, because it is a perfectly appropriate thing for a conscience vote, for a free vote, for MPs to consult with their electorates, to weigh up all the issues and to come to their own conclusions. I expect that that is what the National Conference will do, but I don't want to preempt the debate. Again, no doubt there'll be a robust debate, as there should be, but I will be arguing for a conscience vote. I think the majority of delegates in the end would support a conscience vote.
It'd be a bad look if the Prime Minister was rolled.
Well, clearly the Prime Minister's put a position out there, and I support a conscience vote not just because it's the Prime Minister's position, but because I believe strongly it's the right thing to do, and I think that's what the majority of the National Conference would agree.
Some members of the right say they'll even cross the floor and risk expulsion if there was a fundamental shift in policy on this.
Well, look, there are people in the caucus, in the Parliament, with strong views. There are people who've given undertakings to their electorate based on Labor policy at the time, and I do think there will be MPs who would be very concerned about a National Conference vote which tried to bind any particular position. Now, I've not had that discussion with many colleagues. I simply make the point that I think conscience votes are a good thing. I think they show the Parliament as it should be. Whenever we have a conscience vote, the community feedback is very positive about the quality of the debate. MPs researching the issue, thinking about it, questioning their conscience, consulting with various people in their community and having a proper debate on the floor of the conference. And if we are to have a debate about gay marriage in Australia, I think it would have a lot more community support if the community understood and accepted that this was something being debated on the floor of the National Parliament, not something just decided on party lines, a typical Labor-Liberal agenda. As I say, I've said before that conscience votes should and can be a more common feature of the Australian body politic, and this is, I think, a very clear case of where a conscience vote is appropriate, just as it was in Queensland last night.
Which way would you vote in any conscience vote?
Well, I would take the same approach as I had with all other conscience votes. I'd be talking to my electorate about it. I'd be considering the legislation before the Parliament. We don't actually have legislation before the Parliament. I'd be talking to people on both sides of the argument in my electorate, as I've already done, and then I'd be releasing my decision to my electorate and on the floor of the Parliament. I think the important thing to do is actually agree through the National Conference that this is an appropriate thing for a conscience vote first.
On the broader argument about democratising the ALP, what do you think about Kevin Rudd's proposals to empower the rank and file in terms of direct elections for President, for National Secretary, even for delegates? He even said that he's open to debate on the idea of direct election of the parliamentary leader. What's your view on those suggestions?
Well, look, I think this is the key debate, and I think the National Conference will take some steps, but I hope the debate continues after National Conference, because I do think the Labor Party really needs to tackle these issues. I think Kevin Rudd's contribution has been a good one. I think Sam Dastyari, the General Secretary of New South Wales Party, has made some very sensible suggestions and contributions. Bruce Hawker, a regular commentator on your show, has likewise done the same. I do think the Labor Party needs to assess the situation in relation to changes over recent years. Other Labor parties around the world have made these sorts of changes. This has been a contest in the Labor Party since the time we were formed, the contest between the appropriate role of the rank and file and the caucus. The Labor Party in Britain 30 years ago made the change to a broader constituency for electing the party leader, for example. I think that's a debate we should be having in Australia. I don't think it's automatic that the caucus should be the only constituency for electing the party leader, that there's a case for examining having a broader election of the party leader for various reasons, including empowering the party membership. I think the caucus should be able to implement its policy. The elected representatives should be able to develop and implement policy and take it to the people and argue it on the floor of the parliament. But I also think there's a very strong case for examining broader party reform to really ensure that progressive Labor supporters across the country have a say in key decisions, in key personnel matters across the board. So I'm a very strong supporter of having this debate, and I hope that the National Conference we have on the weekend is the beginning of that process, not the end of it.
So you're open to discussion on it, or would you advocate rank and file votes for the parliamentary leader?
Well, look, I think there's a strong case for examining having the caucus as one of the constituencies for electing a party leader into the future, and having a broader feedback and process for party members generally. I also support Julia Gillard's call for primaries in pre-selections to be considered and trialled. I think all those things need to be on the agenda. And I make this point. If the Labor Party goes down this reform road, I think it won't be too long before other political parties, including the Liberal Party, will be forced to examine similar things. I think all political parties need to be examining the ways that they involve people in their decision-making process. I think that in times past, when union membership was high and social media didn't exist and people were prepared to go to branch meetings, that might have been an appropriate model. The Labor Party's current model might have been an appropriate model. I don't think that's the case anymore. I strongly support Sam Dastyari, Bruce Hawker, Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard in the suggestions they've made about party reform. I think every generation of senior party leaders, ministers and party executives owes it to the great Australian Labor Party to examine everything possible to leave the party in stronger shape than we inherited, to reform the party, to grow the party and leave it in stronger shape. I think that's our primary responsibility as senior people in the party, and that's certainly a debate that I'd be looking forward to being a part of.
Okay, one final question on politicians' pay. I know it's independent, the Independent Remuneration Tribunal makes the call, but it's a bad look a couple of days after the mid-year budget update.
Well, Kieran, the first I knew of this was when I read in the paper this morning that apparently we're all getting pay rises. I read it in the Telegraph. I'm not aware of the Remuneration Tribunal's recommendations. I'm not even aware that they've concluded their report. If they have, it hasn't been presented to ministers. So I really can't comment on whether what's in the paper today is right or wrong. The Remuneration Tribunal is independent. They do make these determinations. We're just going to have to wait and see what they determine. I would be singularly unsurprised if they recommend that certain conditions be abolished or changed and reduced, and other conditions, including salary, may be increased. But that's a matter for them to make their findings on. I'm not aware that they have made their findings, and I'm certainly not aware of what they are.
Chris Bowen, appreciate your time.
Thanks, Kieran. Nice talking to you.